What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's an exciting time for Warhammer 40k because we are just about to dive into the World Championships of Warhammer. That is the big 40k event happening this week. Games Workshop has extended golden tickets to players who have won or achieved accolades at a wide variety of competitive events and invited them all down to Atlanta, Georgia. And just this week, we have been taking a look at the lists that these cutting-edge players have decided to take into what is probably the most competitive metagame in the world. And oh boy, are there some wild ones. I, in fact, just spent 4 hours on stream earlier this week sifting through all of these lists. You can go check out all of that over on my live stream from earlier in this week. It is timestamped, so if you want to take a peek at what folks are playing in your favorite faction, it's all in there. But this is a video of my top 5 favorite picks for the most creative and the wildest lists being played at this year's World Championships. And with no further ado, I think we should just dive in. As always, if you enjoy this style of Warhammer 40k list review content, please don't hesitate to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube stuff, and let's get into it. Let's start relatively soft with Astra Militarum, being played by none other than Nemo the fish. He's been lost at sea for many years, but he has arisen as an Astra Militarum player, and I've actually talked about some of this player's lists in the past. In fact, in a Best Armies in 40k video a couple of weeks ago, this player won with a very similar variety of, it was actually themed as a UNSC military unit from Halo, which is very cute. To the World Championships, Nemo is bringing a very similar variety, so let's talk about exactly what's in it. This is an airdrop focused Astra Militarum list, infantry only, without a single vehicle making an appearance. No tank commanders, no Rogaldorns, no super heavies, no chimeras. Everything is either a ground pounding infantryman or a paratrooper. They're going to overwhelm you with their numbers and their maneuverability and just sandpaper you down. This list was being led by a Acadian command squad. We also had 2 Death Corps marshals, as well as Gaunt's Ghosts and 3 Militarum Tempestus command squads. Now, importantly, one of the Tempestor Primes is the Warlord, which unlocks Tempestus Scions, not Aquilons. That's important to know. Only Tempestus Scions as a battle line option. The reason that that's important is that they start to trigger all of your battle line effects within the Pariah Nexus mission pack. This things you can do things like score secret missions like War of Attrition using those Tempestus Scions. They can also raise banners. They can perform actions using stalwarts. Lots and lots of additional effects get unlocked because the Tempestor Prime is the Warlord. You lose access to Lord Solar Leontis if you want a different unit as your Warlord, but that Tempestor Prime is a pretty good option. Now, we also have 2 special characters in the army, Ursula Creed and Sly Marbo. Now, Ursula Creed can combo attach alongside the Acadian command squad because they are able to attach 2 officers into them, as long as only one of them is a command squad with Acadian shock trooper unit. This means that Ursula Creed can basically, like we see Lord Zola Leontis do in most lists, use the Acadian command squad's Master Vox to project her orders 24 inches away. She issues 2 orders to regiment units, so this is going to be a huge boon to the army. We also have an order coming from that platoon squad commander as well, so we have a baseline of orders that we can issue to our infantry unit. In addition to that, the Tempestus command squads can issue orders when they arrive. They are bringing command rods, so they can be affected by 2 orders at a time, and Gaunt's Ghosts can also issue an order either to themselves or to a regiment unit when they come out of reserve as well. So you could have a command squad drop down, drop Ibran Gaunt next to them, and issue 2 orders, one from the Tempestor Prime and one from the Gaunt's Ghosts, into that unit and benefit from both of them. We also have Sly Marbo in the list. Sly is a really interesting inclusion, and it seems like he is some technology that's kind of being unlocked at the World Championships this year because I haven't really seen him in the past. However, he is getting a lot of play at this competition. Now, exactly why is he good? First off, he's a lone operative character for only 65 points. That's already great. He has the ability to move after shooting, and he has a reactive fire. So if you attack him or anything nearby, he's able to fire back. Then, after every time he fires, he can move. This also works on Overwatch, so he's very difficult to take down. If you move up into his lone operative range to try to kill him, he can Overwatch you and then move away, putting you out of range to attack, or even just simply being out of charge range. All of that is great, But the biggest benefit on this guy's datasheet, I guess in addition to that, is the fact that he is a regiment unit. This means he can receive orders from these other officers like Ursula Creed. The most important one here is move, move, move for an additional 3 inches on his movement characteristic. This not only affects him during your movement phase, if you order him in the command phase, but will also apply until your next command phase, meaning that if he fires his gun, he's then able to make use of that +3 movement on his move after shooting. In addition, he's also able to do that during the opponent's turn. So for example, he can get move, move, move to make him move characteristic 9, move 9 inches up, shoot his gun, move an additional 9 inches up to score a secondary like engaged in all fronts or behind enemy lines. When your opponent moves up to attack him, he fires at them with Overwatch for 1 CP, and then after firing, gets to make a move again, moving 9 inches back behind terrain or out of range for the opponent to attack him with Lone Operative. This guy seems incredibly flexible. He's also pretty good at dealing damage, especially against infantry units, and he's an infiltrator, so he can block out enemy infiltrators, and he's in a good position to score secondaries on early turns. In addition, he's also just a lone operative guy who can stand on objectives. He just seems incredibly valuable for the points cost. Now, what is the rest of this army composed of? We have a Cadian Shock Trooper squad, as I mentioned, for Ursula Creed and her command squad to join into. We also have 3 units of Custodian jungle fighters to add some much needed mid-board control to the army. These guys are going to be able to scout up into the center and just absorb the middle of the table, contest objectives, and complete secondaries. Everything you love. Now, we need to actually hold down objectives. Custodian jungle fighters are not, unfortunately, that difficult to kill. However, the 2 units of 20 Death Corps of Krieg certainly are. There are 2 Death Corps marshals in the army that can attach into these guys, giving them their own instance of orders, but also giving them a 5+ feel no pain. Alongside an order like take cover for +1 save characteristic, these guys can be very difficult to take down, and if you don't kill them, their Death Corps Medipack regenerates models back into the unit, potentially flipping control of objectives. If they are non-battle shocked at the start of your turn, you can also order them with duty and honor, for example, to get them additional OC value and just make them hold down those objectives in the middle incredibly securely. Now, following those up are another 30 scouts. These guys are going to be following those Custodian jungle fighters into the middle of the table. We have 3 units of 10 Kazarkin. These are an elite scouting infantry unit. They issued themselves their own orders, and they have a bunch of special weapons capable of doing a bunch of damage. Just generally a great unit, and between those 60 models moving up the table, plus the 40 Death Corps that are harder to kill behind them, this army has a ton of board control. Now, last but certainly not least are the Tempestus Scions themselves, which are really the highlights of the army. We have 3 units of 10 Tempestus Scions that those Tempester Primes and their command squads can attach into. Each of these are equipped with 2 melta guns and 2 plasma guns, adding on then the additional melta gun and plasma gun being brought by the command squad. So you have 3 of each of those special weapons, plus all of the hotshot las guns from the rest of the team. Those are going to be able to get benefited by 2 orders at a time because of the Tempester Prime's command rod, and he gives them sustained hits 1. So when they attack enemies on objectives, they're getting hit rerolls, probably +1 to hit from take aim, allowing you to reroll your hits and fish for lethals from the detachment ability if you're targeting non-monsters or vehicles, and sustained hits from the Tempester Prime's ability. And you can also get additional attacks on those plasma guns by also ordering them first rank fire, second rank fire from Ibram Gaunt. This gives a unit a grand total of 9 plasma gun shots and 3 melta gun shots, plus somewhere in the realm of 19 hotshot las gun and las pistol shots, giving these guys an immense potential for damage, and especially against those lighter enemy units. Last and certainly not least, we're also bringing 30 Tempestus Aquilons into the army as well. Now, the World Championships of Warhammer, as I discussed in my video last week about their special FAQ, has significantly nerfed the Tempestus Aquilon datasheet. They're now no longer able to use their precision drop when deep striking. However, they can still use it during your own turn. So to be honest, that's still an incredible use case for them. They're bringing melta guns as well as their hotshot las weapons and special weapons, a sentry flamer that's able to fire twice when they arrive, because once when they set up, as well as once during the standard shooting phase. And with that close range deep strike, they don't take up the same real estate that the regular Tempestus Scions want to do when they're setting up on the battlefield, which can get a little clustered since we're talking about running 100 infantry to the center of the table and deep striking 45 Tempestus Scions. in addition to these aquilons. So having additional space to deploy in thanks to that precision drop is a huge benefit to these guys. And not to mention the fact that they're going to be able to use that capacity to score secondaries, even in instances where the opponent is trying to block you and actively trying to stop you from doing things like deploying teleport homers in their deployment zone. This army is absolutely insane. It's bringing immense numbers of infantry, immense numbers of forward operators, and immense amounts of board control, following that up with a ton of deep striking threats that are able to come at you from literally all sides, one of which is probably going to be able to reinforce itself. And with the combined firepower and the weight of just dozens of special weapons across all of these many units, you'll be able to take down even heavy targets with just mass shots from Melta and plasma guns. As I mentioned before, this list has already proven itself in past events by going undefeated at a large GT level event, and if other players aren't prepared for it, it definitely could do as well at the World Championships. Now let's move over and talk about some Death Guard. Justin Signer Delorme is running a plague company from Death Guard that is focused on a datasheet that has been much maligned over the course of the edition so far. Now, most of this Death Guard list might look fairly normal. It's got 2 Terminator Sorcerers, which after the October update have been incredibly popular for their ability to not only once per game deal a ton of damage by burning their little familiar for an additional attack bonus, either in melee or with their psychic ranged attack, but also their ability to reduce incoming damage in melee. We also have Typhus and a Lord of Contagion, but last and maybe least is a Death Guard Demon Prince, a ground-pounding Demon Prince with the Living Plague enhancement. This increases the size of his auras, including his contagion range, meaning that he starts his contagion range at 6 inches rather than the normal 3, and projects it up to 9, 12, and even 15 inches very quickly over the course of the game. Now, the reason that that is important is that, like all of the other Demon Princes, the Death Guard Demon Prince has a protective effect for nearby infantry. While other Demon Princes might grant stealth or cover, the Death Guard Demon Prince gives you a 6+ feel no pain. This is extremely useful on units with a high wounds characteristic, and that is what we're getting with the 20 Blightlord Terminators that this army is also including. Now, it's been kind of an ongoing question around the community how cheap a Blightlord Terminator needs to get before it starts seeing significant play, and it seems like we might finally have gotten to that point. These guys are 31 points a model, just about 10 points per wound, for a 3 wound body with a toughness 6 defensive profile, a 2+ armor save, and a 4+ invulnerable save. They're also then potentially protected by other effects like the weapon skill or ballistic skill reduction from the contagion granted by Nurgle's gift. They can also then be buffed by the nearby Demon Prince, also giving them a 6+ feel no pain, meaning that those high volume 3 damage weapons that are so good at sweeping these infantry are significantly less optimal against them, because every once in a while, one of those Terminators will shake a single damage and have to eat an entirely additional converted attack to kill them. They're also able to bring a wide variety of weapons. The units in this list in particular are bringing a pair of Blight Launchers, 2-shot Strength 6 AP1 2 damage attacks, a pair of Plague Spewers for their anti-infantry utility, as well as 2 Flails of Corruption. Each Terminator swings 4 times with a Strength 5 AP2 melee attack with lethal hits. The Flail of Corruption improves that with an additional 2 attacks at only AP1, but with an additional damage. And again, all of these are potentially buffed by Contagions of Nurgle, reducing toughness and armor save characteristics as well. So the Blightlord Terminators bring a pretty hard hitting profile. While it's not quite as impressive as Death Shroud Terminators, it is definitely nothing to shake a stick at, and they're also fairly resilient, especially for their points cost. We're following that up with 2 units of 2 Chaos Spawn and 2 units of 10 Death Guard Cultists to act as utility and score some points, a unit of Death Shroud Terminators, which is likely an attachment for either Typhus or the Lord of Contagion. I imagine it's Lord of Contagion, but I'm sure it depends on the matchup. We have 2 Fetid Bloat Drones, as well as some of Death Guard's patented allies, 1 unit of Nurglings for some mid-board control and utility, as well as 2 War Dog Brigands to add some very powerful shooting to the army. While a lot of Death Guard armies right now are focused on these really heavy shooting batteries that are using Contagions of Nurgle and the stacking buffs that they can provide to make units like War Dog Brigands and Plague Burst Crawlers and Predator Destructors incredibly good at ranged attacks. This unit in particular, running by Justin, is taking all these Blightlord Terminators and trying to utilize the classic Death Guard strategy of just tanking out their opponent. Especially alongside the Terminator Sorcerers joined into those Blightlord units, they could be -1 damage, high toughness, with potential stacking penalties to hit, as well as a 6+ feel no pain from the nearby Demon Prince. All of that together creates an incredibly scary frontline. Now, talking about an incredibly scary front line, let's move over and talk about an absolutely insane Adeptus Custodes list. This is Michael Armour's Custodes Shield Host. Now, this starts already pretty interestingly with a Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. Not a datasheet that you see too often. This guy's running a Hurricane Bolter and from the Hall of Armory's enhancement, improving the strength and damage characteristics of his Interceptor lance by 1. That gives this guy a bunch of 3 damage melee attacks with lance, meaning he's basically wounding the entire game on 4s or better, which makes him pretty scary, especially given the fact that after the fight phase once per game, he can fall back and just leave combat in order to protect himself. Pretty useful unit, although fairly expensive. We're also running an Anathema Psychona Rhino and 2 units of Witch Seekers to give that scout, adding some on-board presence, some mid-board control, as well as a lot of utility to the army. Now, from there, things progress pretty normally. We have 2 Caladius Grav Tanks with Arachnus Heavy Blaze Cannons. These guys have been classic since the start of the edition, just as ridiculously efficient anti-tank shooting for the faction. We also have in the Imperial Agent slot 2 Navigators, which are able to protect the army by preventing enemies from setting up within 12 inches of them, keeping your backline objectives safe, even as the remainder of the army moves forward. This is very important for Adeptus Custodes of any variety, because they tend to be pretty light on the table and not very good at screening, but this army in particular, because the rest of the list is entirely Dreadnoughts. It's just insane. We have 2 Telamon Heavy Dreadnoughts, those equipped with their Caestus, their big fist, as well as an Arachnus Storm Cannon. Alongside the Caestus, that gives them a lot of anti-infantry shooting, which helps this pretty low attack volume army clear out random utility units that they'll need to, while the Caladius Grav Tanks and the melee attacks can take out the big stuff. Speaking of which, we have 2 Contemptor Galladus Dreadnoughts. These are the shield-equipped Contemptors with a 4+ invulnerable save and -1 to be wounded in melee. These guys are going to be the tanks of the army, a solid bulwark against enemies pounding on them. The Telamon Heavy Dreadnoughts can certainly help with that since they have a built-in -1 damage, but they are significantly more expensive and valuable than the Contemptor Galladus, which I think you're okay with trading away as long as you can get your opponent to expose themselves and get shot by Caladius Grav Tanks. We also then have 2 Venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts, and these guys are a little bit more damage focused. They have multi-meltas, so they're able to put out a reasonable amount of anti-tank shooting in melee, especially once they get close, and they're difficult to take down given the fact that they reanimate themselves once per game when destroyed on a 2+. Despite the fact that the army has a relatively low attack volume, all of its attacks are fairly effective, given the fact that they're all basically at a minimum 3 damage. And being able to improve that with Martial Katas by getting additional attack volume from sustained hits, or even punching up with the relatively low strength Contemptor Galladus with lethal hits, and using the Shield Host ability to improve their critical hits to trigger those effects more often, or to shore up their EP value against particularly heavily armored enemies, makes those attacks convert more effectively, and certainly makes them a lot scarier in melee. It's no wonder that we would take Shield Host for a list like this. However, the downside of the list is its interminable slowness. I think it is going to have to make some pretty smart use of strategic reserves, as well as a threat overload, pushing all of the Contemptors and the Caladius Grav Tanks into the center of the table, and hoping that they can still get to melee, even with their opponent attacking them, just given the fact that basically the entire army, at least all of the melee threats in the army, are somewhere around between move 6 and move 8, and unlike infantry, can't go through walls, which does make things a lot tougher for them. Still, this is an absolutely wild variety of an army, and while most Adeptus Custodes armies are focused on units like Blade Champions and Custodian Wardens in order to deliver themselves into melee, this one is just putting their faith in the ancient engines of war and hoping that these Dreadnoughts are going to be able to get the job done. And to be honest, I'm definitely rooting for them. Now, let's move on and talk about a little bit of a faster army. Moving over to the Space Marine side of the field, Olivier Weiss, who we have discussed on this channel before for his excellent play at the WTC using a ridiculous Black Templar horde of Crusaders, has in fact moved over to another dark armored subfaction of the Space Marines and started playing Dark Angels. But this is not a normal Dark Angels list. You think about Dark Angels and maybe there's an Azrael in there, maybe there's some Deathwing Terminators and some Inner Circle companions, but no, not today. Instead, we're doing our best to ape the Ironstorm Spearheads of old. In this case, we're running Company of Hunters, a detachment that has seen basically no competitive play since it was originally released, but has some pretty impressive detachment effects, allowing the entire army to fall back or advance and still shoot, making it ridiculously flexible. So if you can source really high impact shooting that normally doesn't really want to be engaged in melee, the Company of Hunters detachment ability is incredibly good, extending your threat range with those weapons and making it so that you can skirmish with enemy melee armies because their ability to engage you and shut down your shooting is nullified. Now, what does the list include? Is it a stack of Ravenwing, an incredible horde of bikers, or some of the unique aircraft that the Ravenwing gets access to? No, it's a bunch of tanks and stuff. The army is including a combi weapon lieutenant to grant wound rerolls, Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels himself, to add an incredibly powerful melee counterpunch in and of himself. We also have 3 Tech Marines to buff up the vehicles in the army. Alongside that, there are a ton of vehicles. 3 Ballistis Dreadnoughts, as well as 3 Predator Destructors, a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, and 2 Vindicators. Following that up as some utility are an Infiltrator Squad and 2 Invader ATVs. Now, there's a lot of weird synergy going on in this list. First of all, the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike is an incredible datasheet. At some point, once I have time, I'm going to make a datasheet deep dive on the Stormspeeder datasheets because the Hammer Strike definitely deserves some discussion as being maybe one of the better datasheets in Space Marines at the time, at least in this update. This guy is able to strip cover from enemies and also packs a pretty impressive punch himself with 2 missile launchers as well as 3 Melta shots at an 18-inch range and 2 crack grenade launchers. It's all fairly good, especially once he gets up close and personal, and even if he's not able to kill his target or he just simply splits fire between 2 units, pounding all of his strength 9 anti-tank shooting into one target and flinging his grenades somewhere else. One of those targets gets cover stripped from it, which means he could potentially kill a unit and then set up a second unit to be killed by the rest of the army. Definitely improving the output of things like Predator Destructors that can, in some cases, be very negatively impacted by cover. The other benefit here is that being a Stormspeeder, this guy gets the Ravenwing keyword. So he actually unlocks a lot of the synergies within the detachment that Ravenwing units would normally enjoy. He could be -1 to be hit, which is kind of nice, but importantly, he can also use an uppy-downy effect going into strategic reserve. Now, normally, for most Ravenwing units, this would mean that they then come off the table edge in a future turn, except the Hammer Strike has Deep Strike, so it's able to override the normal strategic reserve rolls and come in 9 inches outside of enemies anywhere on the table. This means that its short range is pretty well counteracted, given that it's going to be able to set up basically wherever it needs to be any turn that you need it. And with relatively long range missile launchers, it's basically impossible to dodge this thing shooting you and stripping your cover away. The Invader ATVs are also incredibly important as well. They are also mounted units, so they get the Ravenwing keyword, and they're able to use stratagems like stickying objectives, which can be incredibly useful for an army that is as low on the ground as this one is. And for the rest of it, there is very little internal synergy. However, you still get stratagems like Smokescreen and Armor of Contempt to protect your tanks. And over the course of the game, you're going to be able to shoot those tanks very consistently, given the fact that they can always advance and shoot, and they can always fall back and shoot. So as long as it's utilizing those synergies from those Ravenwing units over the course of the game, you're going to be able to apply consistent damage to your enemy with that very solid Space Marine shooting. Now, last but certainly not least, let's move ourselves over to the Xenos side of the battlefield and talk about some Tyranids. There is one list that has generated a lot of discussion on the lead up to this World Championships of Warhammer, and that list is Aimée Jacquin's Vanguard Onslaught. Now, most of this list looks fairly normal. Vanguard Onslaught is the forward operator and Lictor focused style of detachment from Tyranids. It is very aggressively oriented. It gives you advance and charge in your Vanguard Invader units, as well as some effects to make them tougher to pin down, have some interesting battle shock synergies, as well as difficult to kill. The army starts off fairly normal with a Broodlord, the Death Leaper, a Winged Tyranid Prime, and a Neurotyrant with Hunting Grounds to potentially battle shock enemies arriving on the battlefield to screw with their strategic reserve and utility. We also have a Gargoyle unit, a single Biovore to score, as well as 20 Gene Stealers, 2 units of 5 and a unit of 10 that can attach with that Broodlord. That gives you a lot of scouting potential. We have a couple Infiltrators in the form of the Death Leaper. There are also 2 Lictors and 2 Neurolictors in there as well, so we can screen out enemy forward operators, give ourselves a good position to run those Gene Stealers up the table, and try to lock in the opponent in their deployment zone and deal some damage in the early game. In order to continuously score in the later game, we have 2 units of 3 Raveners, which are themselves very fast, good at clearing infantry, but also able to up down and score some points as the game moves on. And we have a unit of melee bioweapon Tyrannid warriors that can attach with the Tyrannid Prime and act as our late game melee anchor. These guys do a ton of damage that I've talked about in a previous video discussing melee bioweapon warriors. Now, the last and definitely not least inclusion in this army is good old Harridan, the Tyrannid Harridan, the super heavy flyer from the army. Now, in 9th edition, Harridan saw a little bit of play. I talked about him quite extensively because he is an insane data sheet, but he has some extremely unique synergy within Vanguard Onslaught. Now, there are several detachments that actually use this guy fairly well in Tyranids. Synaptic Nexus, for example, can improve his reliability and protect him. Invasion Fleet just sort of generally buffs everything with Feel No Pains and sustained hits. All of those are good for Harridan. But the big thing that Vanguard Onslaught does is it allows him to arrive on the battlefield in the first battle round. Now, why is this important? What exactly does a Harridan do? First off, this thing is an aircraft. So I have a video that I made a couple months ago discussing all of the aircraft rules in 40K. If you need to brush up on those, go check that video out. But long story short, this guy will have to start in strategic reserve and give himself a minimum movement over the course of the game if he remains in aircraft mode. Alternatively, he can remove the aircraft keyword from himself, become a move 20, essentially ground-based unit using the hover characteristic. However, loses the benefits of being a flyer like infinite movement and the ability to dodge engagement by enemy melee attackers that don't have fly themselves. Obviously, the downside of having to start in strategic reserve is huge for a unit that costs over 600 points. Basically, a third of your army begins off the table and will only get 4 battle rounds to act over the course of the game. And the Harridan does enough damage that you really want it to be on the table as early as possible. This includes 2 dire biocannon, D6 plus 6-shot blast weapons at strength 10 AP3 for a flat 3 damage. That strength 10 is fairly middling against high toughness enemies, except that using frenzied metabolism, the Harridan is able to potentially take wounds to itself in order to get +1 to wound on all of its ranged attacks. This makes this weapon high volume enough to kill infantry, especially medium or heavy infantry with multiple wounds, and do significant damage to even high toughness monsters and vehicles. The Harridan is dangerous to everything, and if he is in hover mode, he also has some D6 damage melee attacks to follow that up. If he remains in aircraft mode, he also gets the benefit of ignoring ruins for line of sight. He just treats all terrain as true line of sight, and given the fact that the Harridan is massive, true line of sight is actually really easy to get in a lot of instances because it has so many outstretched, huge parts. Given the fact that the Games Workshop internal terrain sets for GW events tend to be relatively low to the ground and not good at blocking line of sight to enormous units, this actually makes the Harridan incredibly scary on this style of terrain set. Now, the downside is that there is basically no synergy within Vanguard Onslaught with the Harridan for most of its abilities. It is bringing a gargoyle unit, which is able to potentially carry to the battlefield on its belly, which is kind of cute. So it may be bringing those gargoyles along with it, although they're also just good deep striking normally. But the big benefit here is the seeded broods stratagem. This is literally the only targetable stratagem on the Harridan in this detachment, but it allows you to set up from strategic reserve 1 round earlier than normal. And this gives you the benefit of both worlds. The Harridan gets to retain its aircraft characteristics. It also gets to start off the table, which is incredibly important because, as I mentioned before, it's so big that it can't really hide from enemy ranged attack. And it also allows you to use the Harridan on the first battle round. This means that you, for 1 CP, you can basically get all of the upsides of the aircraft characteristic with the loss of the biggest downside. It also means that going second, this list is ridiculously difficult to deal with. It is already good going first because it's going to be able to shoot you with a Harridan and probably charge you with 10 to 20 Gene Stealers on the first turn. But going second, it's able to hide its models fairly effectively, keep the Harridan off the table until the bottom of the first round, meaning that the attacker loses an entire turn of trying to shoot the Harridan in order to kill it before it's able to annihilate their army. You can then seeded broods, bring it in on the first turn, kill something with the Harridan, and proceed to try to execute the Gene Stealer containment that we discussed earlier. Unfortunately for the Harridan, it's not very difficult to kill. It does have 30 wounds, which is pretty impressive. aggressive, and it is largely going to be probably hanging out towards the back of the table, just using its aircraft movement to swoop around back and forth towards the tail end. However, it is only toughness 10 with a 3+ save and no invulnerable save to speak of, so once attacks start getting leveled at the Harridan, especially big anti-tank shooting, it will go down very quickly. So limiting the number of rounds that this guy is being attacked by the opponent is crucial to keeping it alive. But if Aimée is able to utilize that early game tempo and the incredible shooting from this huge monster to leverage damage onto the enemy, it has a pretty good chance of doing fairly well. Ultimately, I think it's just cool to see Harridan back on the table, and I like the technology of including him in Vanguard Onslaught in order to circumvent most of the downsides of taking an enormous flyer like this. And with that, those are all of my favorite armies at the World Championships of Warhammer, the most insane armies and creative builds that we're going to be seeing this weekend. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.